Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once more to Canon 211 on the Paleocrat Diaries. I am your host. I'm Jake Fowler, and I am joined today with Dr. Joshua Brown, who teaches at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. Dr. Brown, welcome to Canon 211. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. No, the pleasure is mine because I love to interview Communio scholars. I love to interview people who write for the New Ressourcement. I'd even interview, people that wrote for Novet Vetera and so on and so on. You, sir, you have written a very interesting article in the current issue of Communio, the spring 24 issue of Communio, titled Confucianism and Catholicism on the Family. I read the abstract, and it immediately piqued my interest. The abstract is that little blurb that you get like as an introduction, and it said, I'm paraphrasing, Dr. Healy and the gang over at Communio said that you consider Confucianism to be analogous to Aristotelianism or Platonism as a sort of preparation for the gospel. So yes, it's not Catholicism. It's not like interchangeable, obviously. But if we can take Confucian thought and what that is for those who practice it, particularly in China, we have an opportunity. And so that's what really grabbed my attention and caused me to want to read yours first out of all the others. And then, we started emailing and here we are. So without further ado, welcome once again. And perhaps we can begin. Would you mind offering a brief overview of Confucianism? What is it?
Sure, certainly. So again, thanks for the invitation to come and speak about the article and my work. It's a lot of fun. So Confucianism, one easy way to think about it is it is a philosophical tradition, or broadly intellectual tradition, right? From China, centered around the teachings of Confucius. Now, actually, there is a bit of an issue here that I always have to talk about, that the term Confucianism is actually somewhat of a misnomer. In Chinese, we call Confucianism Rujia, which means the school of the Ru, and Ru means literati, right? So it's actually, and the Ru predates Confucius, actually. So Confucius, or Kongzi, lived in at the end of the spring and autumn period in China. And we know the Ru existed before then. And so the center of the Ru is really the classical learning of the ancient texts of Chinese culture. And we're talking about, in Confucius's time, he's in, the 450 BC. So he's talking about ancient texts, from thousands of years before him, or at least thought to be thousands of years before him. And the idea is essentially that the Ru desire to study the ancient texts, especially these central 5 classics that we could get into if you like, and see how they, and also the rulers and the governors who created them, lived out both individual moral flourishing and social flourishing, right? And they say these are the key to be able to do this again, right? So we need to tap back into the wisdom of the ancients in China, and so study those very seriously, and form society and families and individuals around the rituals that these people instituted, right? So that's essentially what Confucianism is. There's, you could say some debate about whether it's philosophy or religion. We can talk about why those debates are misguided somewhat. But for Catholic purposes, it's best to think about it as a philosophical tradition, especially a moral philosophical tradition.
Yeah, the way you're explaining it, it sort of sounds like it's an ancient Chinese degree in humanities. Like they would read their own classics and study and be familiar with, the tales from long ago, and then implement them. It seems very, very similar to reading Greek and Roman literature, European literature and medieval philosophy and all these things, and then trying to chart a life based on those principles. So that, for one, I think that sounds really, really neat, really, and very Catholic as well, because it seems like it's emphasizing the received tradition. So
Yes. Yeah.
I appreciate that very much. So thanks for that explanation.
Mhm.
What in particular led you to want to? And I think again, this is something that the Confucians have tapped
Mm,
into in the
yeah.
past. That notion of your place in the family is one of fundamental receptivity.
Yeah.
Um, can you maybe speak to how the authentic Catholic tradition regarding reception of
Mm.
grace, of being from your parents, how Confucianism can help us to draw this out and use it against modern secular worldviews?
Well, okay. So to answer that, first, I could say, kind of piggybacking on the previous things you just mentioned there. Um, one thing I think the Confucianists can help you do is to help Catholics, because you mentioned that it makes sense from a secular perspective, right? And in a strict sense, I mean, Confucianism is a secular tradition. It doesn't have the order of grace. It's not a revealed, doesn't even claim a revealed tradition, right? Um, but it's a very different kind of secularism, right? And I think it's worth noting how much, for example, Catholic families have taken on board the assumptions of this kind of liberal secular age, right?
Mm,
Um, and Confucianism helps us see, like, well, that's not like just because it's not Christian that was there. Like there are other options and stories for how to understand, say, the family. And so one thing it should do is help us to think critically about, well, why do we make the decisions we make about our families? Why do we assume that some things make sense, and do we agree that they make sense, right? So that's one thing it can help you do from a strictly, kind of conversational perspective, I think. In terms of the resources that would draw out, right? So, for example, I have again, I talk about my own work because no one else is really writing on this in the Western traditions that much.
trailblazer.
So, yeah, all three people who read it, it's great. No, okay, um, but I have a book coming out in November. Called Aquinas and the Chinese Masters, where I do this thing with Aquinas a little bit. And one thing I look there is, Matthew 8:20 through 21, where Jesus talks about let the dead bury the dead, right? Um, and I think that's often, at least I was raised Southern Baptist, not Catholic, right? And so that's a slanted perspective, suppose. Um, but I think most of us read that kind of story as simply saying, well, family's not as important as following Jesus, so just do that, right? And so it's kind of like the critique that the guy wants to bury his father.
Mhm.
But what I found when I read that passage in light of Confucianism, which would say burying your father is fundamentally important. Why tell someone not do that? You realize that, like, Aquinas actually has a very sophisticated account of the virtue of burying your father, right? He thinks it's really important that the guy wanted to bury his father, and in fact made him more virtuous than other characters in that section of Matthew, right? So Aquinas actually has a great respect for the desire to bury your father and to carry out those responsibilities. And his articulation of why Jesus tells him to let the dead bury the dead is not or at least for Aquinas, it's not a repudiation of family responsibility. It's a very sophisticated, very specific kind of pastoral critique, right? Um, so for me, for example, it's like that's something that I would not have noticed or cared to notice about, say, Aquinas's presentation, had it not been for trying to read it from that Confucian perspective, right? To see how that question illuminates, opens up. I think that's something it can. That's an example of what it can do, right? To help us to. I've seen this also, like maybe reading Augustine, thing like this. Um, you notice that actually the answers to questions they have more capacities to even recognize they have, right? And I think by extension of that, they actually would challenge a lot of the things we have presumed about why and how the family makes sense in ways that we perhaps have not noticed.
Ladies and gents, the preview is over. To watch the full video, Go to canon211.locals.com and become a member, become a supporter, get access to exclusive content, stay in touch with the Canon 211 community. Well, that's it for today. Never give up. Keep on smiling. And memento mori. Cheers.